Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, the 6th of January, 2026. The headlines are quite dramatic. Donald Trump has said that many Cuban soldiers were killed in Venezuela raid, but called the operation brilliant. The Western allies are very concerned over Trump's demands, simultaneous demands for Greenland. Of course, Trump has many critics, including Robert Reich, who used to work for Bill Clinton, who said that Donald Trump poses a threat to civilization. And one assumes there'll be more and more calls for the United States Congress to institute the 25th Amendment when it comes to replacing the president, the fourth section of that 25th Amendment. And we're going to talk about that today with my guest, Rebecca Lubot, who has a new book out. It's out today. It's called Keeping a Finger on the Button, Presidential Continuity in the Nuclear Age. And it's mostly about the 25th Amendment and the replacement of the president in a case of existential crisis. Rebecca is joining us from New Jersey. Rebecca, we're talking on Tuesday lunchtime, West Coast time. I think I'll put this out tomorrow on the 26th on Wednesday. So stuff will change. But I'm guessing that given you're an authority on the 25th Amendment, that you're getting lots of calls about what it could or should mean in terms of Trump's current behavior.
Yes, that's correct. In large part because this is the 5th anniversary of the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. And there were calls immediately thereafter for invoking the 25th Amendment. And also there was a lot of talk because of perceived and probably real health issues on the part of the president to invoke the 25th Amendment. And then, of course, there's wars brewing on every corner of the globe. And there is one man in the US that has his finger on the nuclear button.
One of the problems, it seems to me, Rebecca, is that people always call for this when the president does things that they're uncomfortable or are angry about. J.B. Pritzker, for example, last year called for it after Trump's sending troops into cities like Chicago. Has this been since, I think the 25th Amendment has been around, since the mid-60s, since 1965. Has this been a perennial feature? Ronald Reagan, of course, famously in 1984 made a joke about bombing the Soviet Union in 5 minutes. I assume there were calls at that point for instituting the 25th Amendment then. Has there been a continual call for the institutionalization of the 25th Amendment over the last 50 or 60 years?
Yes, so you're right. The mid 1960s, the amendment was ratified on February 10th, 1967, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, but also during a period of great anxiety about nuclear weapons. And there have been calls since then, off and on, to use the 25th Amendment. But really, the amendment has 4 sections, and they're clear in that it was never designed by the framers of the amendment to be used in cases of political or policy disagreements. It was not to be used just because one thinks that perhaps the president doesn't have a presidential temperament, or even just because of general thoughts that the president is unfit. It was supposed to be used, at least sections 3 and 4 of the amendment, were supposed to be used due to incapacity, right? Or the term of art used is inability.
But what does that mean, incapacity? Does that mean a degree of madness? We all think, of course, of Stanley Kubrick's great movie, Dr. Strangelove, 1964, of course, came also in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, about madness, maybe not presidential madness, but certainly the madness of people able to use the bomb. What does incapacity, or how did the framers of the 25th Amendment, how did they define incapacity?
That's a great question, Andrew. And I'll back up just a minute by explaining that very quickly the four sections of the amendment. Section 1 is simply that if the president dies in office, the vice president will take over the powers and duties of the presidency. And actually, Section 1 has not been invoked. There were deaths in office of presidents, but none since 1967, as we know. So it has yet to be used. Section 2 says the president will nominate a successor if a vacancy in the vice presidency occurs. And that was used in 1973 and 1974, so used twice within a decade of the amendment's ratification for Ford and Rockefeller, respectively. Section 3 states that if the president transmits a written declaration to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House that he's unable to discharge his duties, the vice president will assume presidential responsibilities as acting president temporarily. And it allows the president to determine when he is able to return to his duties and take back his power. So this was really meant to leave the power in the president's hands to determine inability and determine when that inability has dissipated. And Section 4 has never been used. And that's usually what people are referring to in the media, scholars, et cetera, when they suggest that there's some sort of form of madness and Section 4 should be invoked. And that states that whenever the vice president and a majority of Congress or another body as Congress so designates or creates by law, and Congress has not created such a body as of yet, decide that the president is incapacitated, the vice president will assume the presidential powers until the president submits a letter, a communication to the contrary. And incapacity, however, or inability wasn't defined in the amendment. And keeping a finger on the button it tells the whole story of the 25th Amendment. And it describes that long, arduous journey through Congress and then ratification in the states. And some things were left purposefully vague to let future Congresses decide. And one of those was inability, and it's become problematic. So one of my suggestions is to define inability, or at least have Congress, which they can by law, determine a body, a medical body that is not partial, and it consists of experts, medical experts, to determine what inability means. If it's left to the White House physician who is in the president's chain of command, well, you can see how problematic that is, right?
Especially given Trump's tendency to mislead on his own health and bully his own doctors.
Right. And so to your point about Dr. Strangelove, that is the fear, is that there will be some sort of madness where a president goes mad and in an instant sets off like nuclear Armageddon, right? So that's the problem.
Yeah, no, of course, the amendment came in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dr. Strangelove was based on an American general, Curtis LeMay, Air Force general, who was actually involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK's Cuban Missile Crisis. I think he was much more hawkish, and had he been in charge, maybe none of us would be around today. I have two questions, Rebecca. Maybe they're rather dumb questions, but since it's my show, I can ask them. Why did we need certainly not just Section 4, but why do we need the 25th Amendment when it came to replacing presidents? Presidents had been replaced in office before. JFK was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson took power. It upset a lot of the Kennedys, particularly his brother, in the manner that he did. So prior to the 25th Amendment, what was the nature of succession? And did this change it when, I mean, obviously we haven't had another president assassinated, although the Nixon example is another interesting one. So what did the 25th Amendment do when it came to a vice president replacing a president?
Well, that's right. So we really only had the information that in the Constitution that should a president die or resign from office, that the vice president would take over as president. And back in and we can go all the way back in history, but Tyler set a precedent that he would not be called
President
acting
Tyler,
president.
that is, right?
Exactly, right. And President Tyler set a precedent that he would not be called acting president. It's called the Tyler precedent, that he would actually be president. So he was taking over the powers and duties of the presidency. But the other points that I had described, sections 2, 3, 4, there was no mechanism to replace a vice president should a vice president die in office. So the US has gone through long periods of history when we have not had a vice president. And that had become more and more significant more recently. For example, President Carter was really the president in recent history that gave his vice president, Walter Mondale, more powers. So for a while, the vice presidency was just seen as, you know, a seat that one needed to keep warm in case something happened to the president. But more recently, that vice presidential role has become more significant.
Yeah, and
but
of course, one wonders what J.D. Vance is thinking these days. Certainly, if the 25th Amendment was used, he would benefit. It does require a very different kind of Congress from today's rather supine one, doesn't it, Rebecca? I mean, realistically, even if Trump behaved in an odder way and started arbitrarily attacking our supposed allies, perhaps Denmark over the Greenland issue, what would have to happen certainly in today's Congress? Something would have to dramatically change, wouldn't it?
Well, the mechanisms of the 25th Amendment really require a vice president in office, particularly Section 4, because it would be the vice president and a majority of Congress, a majority of the cabinet to determine the president was enabled and to invoke the 25th Amendment. But overall, the 25th Amendment was designed to leave the power in the hands of the president to determine an inability and to take the powers and duties of office back when the inability was over. So it was only viewed to be used in cases of true inability. So Congress's role is, with the 25th Amendment, is really to decide whether or not in that last section, Section 4, is the only place really that Congress plays a role, except for the fact that Congress is in the line of succession, right? So it's the vice president and then the Speaker of the House and then the Senate President pro tempore. And that changed in 1947. And so that's part with the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 during Truman's time, in part because of his relationship with the Speaker. But other than that, Section 4 is really the only place where Congress plays a role at all. And Congress must decide with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate if there is a discrepancy. If the president, for example, says, I'm ready to take back the powers and duties, and the vice president says, had said, no, the president's enabled. So if there's a discrepancy there, that's when the president submits this letter to Congress, and then Congress decides by a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate whether the president can.
Yeah, I mean, you're dodging the question, because I think it's fairly self-evident that Congress isn't going to address this. My sense, Rebecca, is that if it is to be addressed, it's to be addressed within the military. I mean, if Donald Trump really did go crazy, I mean, maybe he already has in Venezuela or Cuba or Greenland or wherever, the resistance is going to come from inside the military, isn't it? Certainly not from a Curtis LeMay who wanted to bomb, but from somebody from within the military who recognizes that the president is irresponsible and perhaps crazy. Is there a role in the 25th Amendment for the U.S. military?
Well, first, to address the sort of your first point about Congress, as far as changes to fill in the gaps of the 25th Amendment, I agree with you. I think Congress is unlikely to take any action, within the next few years, and has been unable to be clear to, sort of put a stop to or even slow down the unprecedented action coming from the administration over the last year. So not dodging that question. But as far as I think when you talk about resistance, are you asking, because the president has his finger on the nuclear button, how they could possibly stop that? Or are you talking about?
Well, yeah, I'm guessing that if there was a real crisis here and people became concerned that Donald Trump has really gone mad, I mean, some people believe he already is mad, but if he's really gone crazy, and if his finger on the button is the issue that threatens the survival not just of the United States, but of the whole world, a lot of the initiative would come from within the military. I mean, senior officers within the military would be calling senior people in Congress, wouldn't they? I mean, this is not really the constitutional stuff is cosmetic. The real issue is what happens behind the Constitution, what happens behind closed doors, in the way in which senior powers within the administration would be talking to one another. And I also presume Vance's role as well. I mean, military people or senior congressional people would come to Vance.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a great time to bring in the anniversary of January 6th, because on January 7th, there was a lot of talk of invoking the 25th Amendment, and we can get into that. And instead, knowing that Vice President Pence would not sign off on that, two cabinet members resigned, Secretary Betsy DeVos and Secretary Elaine Chao. And then on January 8th, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, having failed with soon to be Chuck Schumer, so he was in 2021, soon to be majority leader. He and Schumer and Pelosi reached out to Mike Pence, called him. He purposefully did not take their call. And so having failed that, she promptly reached out to General Milley with the very same concern that you mentioned. She basically said, we have a mad president, as exemplified by the actions on January 6th. And, I'm worried that he's going to bring about a nuclear war. And General Milley had been monitoring other countries who were now on high alert, other nuclear powers, because of the actions here in the U.S. on January 6th. And Milley basically responded, don't worry, Speaker. Yes, President Trump has his finger on the nuclear button, but we won't do anything illegal. And yes, he issues the order, but there's other folks that are involved in actually launching a nuclear weapon. that same day, former Secretary of Defense Perry wrote an article in Politico, so January 8th, 2021 article in Politico, and he asked a question that the framers of the amendment in the 1960s had asked, which was, should any president really have the godlike power to bring about global destruction in an instant? So we're still worried about, the same thing.
But of course, in Trump too, he's got rid of the Millers of the world and replaced them with characters like Hegseth, who don't seem to have any independence of their own. So he's addressed that. What's your take, Rebecca? I mean, every time, and this is Trump's great strength, I think, is every day there's a new crisis, another issue. I mean, January 6th now seems rather minimal, perhaps in some ways, compared to what's happening today. Is there a crisis, or is this just the nature of the new politics of the 2020s? Is this reality television politics and Americans just have to get used to it?
That's also a good question. And you may have caught the article the other day, I believe it was December 30th, by the New York Times, calling the title by the editorial board. The title of the piece was "Donald Trump is the January 6th President." And I think that's very apt, because the fact that he arguably got away with inciting an insurrection on January 6th without any real consequences, and then was reelected to become the 47th president, explains so much of the extra legal activity that he's engaged in over the course of the last year. And so I think that's really the tie-in, that, it's unprecedented action, and it's sort of a magician's trick, right? It's like smoke and mirrors, look over here, and then there's another action being taken over there. And it's almost like this Venezuelan issue. There's so many issues at home, right? Affordability, healthcare, and we could go on, including Epstein. So this was almost like a wag the dog issue, right? And
if it is, then this, and then the New York Times piece, the editorial piece, was discussed over January 6th, is no longer bipartisan. I mean, if it is a wag the dog issue, then there should be no reason to use the 25th Amendment, right? I mean, it's perhaps even rational political behavior. I mean, it's a way of taking people's mind off other stuff, and in some ways no different from other invasions, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Grenada or Panama.
Right. So the 25th Amendment was, again, designed to be used in cases of inability, and it was always supposed to be temporary. It was not designed to be used as a permanent way to remove the president from power.
Like a timeout, right? You send the kid into the corner if they misbehave, and then if they keep their mouth shut for a few minutes, they can come back.
Right. And the way to remove a president, which was, in process after January 6th, was impeachment, is impeachment, right? So Trump was impeached for a second time in 2021. And it's an easier way to do it, because the 25th Amendment, requires that 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, but impeachment requires only a majority vote in the House. But in the Senate, it does require 2/3 vote. And the Senate was really the only ones that could have, at that time, ended Donald Trump's career, because they could have convicted him, removed him, and voted to bar him from holding office again.
What can we learn from history? You appropriate your book is coming out today on January 6th, 2026, Keeping a Finger on the Button. What can we learn from history? I know some of the book covers JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis, his relationship with the Soviet Union. What should and shouldn't we learn about the 25th Amendment from the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of today's what some people see as a crisis, although maybe it's orchestrated. I mean, Cuba has announced that 32 Cuban officers were killed in the US operation in Venezuela. So there's something eerie about the way in which Cuba has got sucked into this current crisis. And Trump has made it clear that Cuba is also on the list of regimes to be replaced.
Right. And that's in part because of Cuba's relationship with and dependency on Venezuela, and in part because Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right? So, and when President Barack Obama, renewed diplomatic ties, he in his announcement that he was doing so, he said it was a White House, press release by email, I think, and it said, that he was getting rid of the last vestiges of the Cold War. But of course, we're still, have these strange relations with Cuba. So I think that I'm not sure if I answered that your question. I want to make sure I'm not dodging anything. So
no, I'm not suggesting. I mean, when I said you dodged it, I mean it's a question that has to be dodged given the nature of things. But is it just coincidental in your view that Cuba has reappeared again in this crisis, or should we read more into it?
Well, if you talk about the Cold War, there's, Russia was very upset that, the U.S., it was the Soviet Union at the time, but, had this relationship with the League of Nations, NATO, all of that was so actively involved, the Marshall Plan before that. And, so very concerned, and said, Stalin had said, the U.S. had missiles pointing at his dacha, right, his house, his compound. So the U.S. essentially, within its sphere of influence, would be Cuba and Canada and Greenland. Although, of course, now with communications and transportations and and globalization, the speed and pace and rate of globalization, we're not so concerned about our sphere of influence because we can reach anywhere in the world. But Cuba, is our neighbor, and again, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So that's where Soviet Union chose to plant its missiles, and that's why the U.S. was so concerned. Now we watch countries like North Korea, and we're concerned when they have the launch capabilities to reach our East Coast and things like that. So because of the speed, time, and pace of globalization, I think that's changed. But Cuba is our I
mean, what has changed, of course, is that the Soviet Union is no longer the Soviet Union. It's Russia. Russia is involved in its own war of colonial conquest in Ukraine, but they've been harshly critical of the U.S. attack on Venezuela, capturing of Maduro, who was a client close to the Russians. It takes two to tango, at least when it comes to a nuclear war. If Russia, which is extremely unlikely, if Russia began to saber rattle over Venezuela or over Cuba, would that, and there was another imminent nuclear war, do you think that might rattle Congress a little bit more on this 25th Amendment?
Well, I hope something will rattle Congress, because I do believe in the separation of powers. And as we discussed earlier, Congress is really not holding the president accountable. And even, our third branch, the Supreme Court, has really not been able to contain him, in part because of the speed and pace of the actions coming from his administration, and in part just because he had appointed so many Supreme Court justices. That was really what was at stake in the 2016 election, the first time he was elected. So that, that's definitely an issue. And I would hope that if, and there's not just, the overt threatening of nuclear war that North Korea has certainly threatened us. And during Trump's first term, I don't know if you recall, but Hawaiians they woke up to an alert that there was a missile incoming. And
yeah, but that didn't reflect on Trump. I mean, lots of stuff does. That had nothing to do with Trump, did it?
No, but you asked if Congress would wake up and if there was a threat, and so I'm saying, well, there could be an overt threat, and there were threats by tweet, right, between Kim Jong-un and President Trump going back and forth. But there's also the danger of accident, miscalculation, or madness, right? And there have been near misses in U.S. history since the development of the bomb, where we could have had an accident. And of course, there's the popular House of Dynamite, that just aired on Netflix.
But that's a big accident. Right. Rebecca, I mean, it's not your fault. This isn't a criticism, but for those of us who are concerned about Trump's behavior and potentially the use of the 25th Amendment, if it continues or becomes more odder, more threatening to world peace, you're not reassuring me very much. I mean, you've written this book on it, and this isn't a criticism because your hands are as tied as everybody else's. But does the 25th Amendment really matter in any way? Had it not been written, what difference would it make? Is it just another piece of a cosmetic constitutional artifact that gets shown off and written about by scholars and theorists like yourself, but actually doesn't matter in any way?
Well, the book was not written to reassure. The book was written because I had access to unmined archives, oral interviews, including of Senator Birch Bayh before he passed away, who's the architect of the amendment, and access to the American Bar Association's records, for example, the U.S. Senate historians' records. So the book was written to try to get valuable information out there for policymakers in the hopes that they would act. So Congress would act before there's some sort of a crisis, because as you point out, it usually does take some sort of catastrophe or crisis. And there is a time for invoking the 25th Amendment. So it's not for policy disagreements or generally perceived unfitness to serve, or just a dislike of the president's temperament. But there is a time to invoke the 25th Amendment, and there is a chance that within the next few years, that time will come. And that would be, my guess is because of the health issues he seems to be having. For example, President Trump was the oldest president a year ago to be sworn into office. And, his father, Fred, had dementia at the age he is now. Never mind the fact that he has stated that he doesn't believe in exercise. And of course, his diet. He has a Diet Coke.
Yeah, but we've been hearing this. I've heard this for years, Rebecca, about Trump. He has certainly more vigor, for better or worse, than Biden, who really was a doddering old man by the end of his administration. This idea of dementia, how does it get proved, and how could that play out? I mean, if his behavior continues to be, at least in some people's mind, a reflection of a demented individual. I know I keep on asking the question. Maybe I'm keep on asking the same question because I want a different answer. But what would need to happen? Would it be his wife? Would it be J.D. Vance? Where would the process for the 25th Amendment, where would it begin? Would it be with his doctors?
Well, Section 1 would be invoked should he die or resign in office, but Section 3 would be if he decided that he was.
Yeah, well, we know that's not going to. I keep on asking the same question because you're dodging it again. We know he's not going to invoke it. If he dies, then the issue is moot. But
so then we're talking about Section 4, which
what needs to happen to begin the process of Section 4?
Right. So either the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, which they got their power, they got their positions because of President Trump. So they are very unlikely to move forward on the 25th Amendment, or Congress needs to designate a body to determine inability. What is inability? And so that would hopefully be an independent body of medical experts. But the first lady, the wife, has played a role. For example, Woodrow Wilson's illness. They called Edith Wilson the presidentress because at the time she kept him aside, and she determined who saw President Wilson, and she looked at his correspondences. But that was in a day and age when foreign policy decisions could be made more slowly. They didn't need to be made instantaneously. Now we
Pre-nuclear
can't afford
weapons,
that.
before America was it remained a great power. And of course, Wilson had a stroke, was it?
Yes.
And he didn't govern, I guess, for a year or two after that stroke. But maybe that had an impact on Versailles and the catastrophe of the 1920s and 30s. So really what you're saying, and I know I keep on putting you on the spot, it's not a criticism of you. You're just you're just a victim of the process as much as the rest of us. This is very unlikely to happen. I mean, could we look back to Watergate and think, well, at least Nixon's the Republicans in Congress eventually turned on Nixon, and there were some members of his cabinet. Is that one model we can look back to and think, well, it's possible things could change?
Right. So, right. And that was Section 1, and then, as we discussed, Section 2 with Ford and Rockefeller. It's possible that that Congress at some point, not in the near future, would designate a body, but it's also very unlikely that that the vice president and a majority of the cabinet would invoke Section 4. What's more likely is that there will be continued discourse in the public and focus on it. But again, the way to sort of remove the president is either to not vote him in office in the first place, or to impeach, which is actually easier to do.
Well, it's easier in theory. In practice, when it comes to Trump, much more difficult. Neither of the movies, we've talked about Strangelove, neither of the great movies which seem eerily resonant now is The Manchurian Candidate, originally a 1959 book by Richard Condon, then another great movie by John Frankenheimer in 1962. The idea of perhaps the president or a senior administration figure being controlled by a foreign government. Does Section 25, does the 25th Amendment, or Section 4 in the 25th Amendment, does that address that it's conceivable that a foreign power might have infiltrated the mind or interests of the US president?
Right. And that's that madness question again, and who determines inability? And Congress left that intentionally blank. They believed that the future Congresses could take action if they so chose, and that they would be motivated by the public good to do so. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have happened.
Well, I hope we survive, Rebecca, for the next 12 hours between talking and posting this. Not a very good joke, I'm afraid. You sound resigned to not much changing. I know I keep on asking the same question, but it's not going to happen in the next 12 hours, but over the next 3 years. Is it conceivable in your mind? You've just written this book on the 25th Amendment. Is it conceivable that Trump, I mean, he seems as if, he made the famous remark about if you even shot someone on Fifth Avenue, you could get away with it. He seems as if, and his strategy is that the worse he behaves, or the crazier it behaves, the more power he has, the more invulnerable it is. Is it conceivable in your mind that he could go too far, that even he could take a step that is just unacceptable, apart from actually destroying the world through some sort of nuclear war?
The composition of the of the Senate and the House is changing. We have the midterms elections coming up. So it's possible that with a different composition that Congress would begin to exercise their powers, and checks and balances that are supposed to happen to occur on the executive branch would actually occur. So I think there's hope there. And there's also, the idea that simple statutes can fill the gaps in the 25th Amendment, and also the idea that the president's finger is the lone finger on the nuclear button. That can also be addressed, so that there's, as the author and scholar Garrett Graff says, no lone zone.
Garrett Graff was on the show. Yeah, another very good writer. Well, the book is out today, Keeping a Finger on the Button. Probably it's not just about the president. It really should be a book, or when we think about fingers on the button, should be congressional fingers in terms of removing Trump if he behaves more and more oddly, declaring war on his allies. But there we have it. Rebecca Lubot, congratulations. An important book, a very, very relevant book. It's out today. And as I said, Rebecca, I hope we survive the next few weeks so that everyone can read your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me.